Josh, how goes it?
Oh, it goes real well. How about yourself, John? Good to see you again.
Yeah, it's going very well. So what are we discussing?
Yeah, so this is a topic I was really excited to do, and basically, if you've paid close attention to a lot of media coverage over the last several years, you may have noticed a new divide that may be emerging and continue to do so. One that we are no longer divided as much by the North and South as we have been for well over a century. But now there's this perception that we're divided by the center and the coasts of America. So I thought it'd be interesting if we actually dove into a lot of the research to see how prevalent this is this accurate, and see what can be done to help, prevent a deeper divide. I personally thought it'd be best to kind of break it up into generally these three core topics. Now,
Okay.
the first being population changes, because we have heard about a lot of people leaving and maybe immigration, outside immigration, illegal immigration, things like that. We're going to look at economic changes. I mean, we have all heard about factories closing down. We've, seen it. It's
Outsourcing.
Exactly. And the third one will be pop culture and just general cultural changes, which also sounds kind of general, but it's something that is very real that we did do a lot of research on, and I'd love to discuss. I think you did some pretty cool research on that.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about the general attitudes and feelings of people in rural America, both in political, how it formulates around their political ideologies, as well as their just general sentiments and feelings. So I'm happy to contribute to the dialogue of what you found as well, and see if they correlate.
Awesome.
Let's do it.
You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
And John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting. So one of the books I've been reading in preparation for this podcast is a book called The Left Behind: Decline and Rage in Rural America. And it's written by one of my favorite sociologists, a guy named Robert Wuthnow, spelled W-U-T-H-N-O-W. He depicts, his researchers went out and talked to 1,000 people and tried to discover what their general sentiment in their town is. So when I talk about feelings of people in small towns and they believe this and they don't like that, I'm really basing it off the research that he and his team did in this book that I highly recommend. One of the statistics he points to right out of the gate in the book is that the decline of population within rural communities is neither unexpected or new. In 1810, he says that we had 95% of Americans living in rural communities. And 200 years later, in 2010, that number was below 20%. So I'm wondering if migration patterns and migration status are reflected in census data or any other data that you have found in your research, and what can you point to that may correlate to that?
It's interesting. The U.S. Census Bureau, which has just arguably the most accurate information on things like this, they did a study and took all their data to analyze the Midwest, where this has been, at least from what we've heard, a pain point. And it shows the change in population between 2010 and 2015. So over those 5 years, they looked at these 12 states and in the Midwest, and the average across America in terms of population increase was 4.1% over those 5 years. And out of these 12 states in the Midwest, 9 of them were below the 4.1 increase. And if you look at some of them like Illinois, plus 0.2%.
Wow.
That is far lower. The only ones that have seen an increase has been the Dakotas and We know that there was recently a discovery of oil. It had kind of an oil rush up there, which explained, North Dakota plus 12%. And also with data and statistics, people need to keep in mind, with a smaller population state like that, 20,000 people moving to Wyoming would skyrocket the percentage because there aren't too many there. But 20,000 people moving to New York City would probably up at like 0.0001%. So that's the caveat I'd like to say. Keep in mind with a lot of percentage based data and statistics. However, the reason this is a good comparison is because it does look at overall averages. But yeah, like that change for Illinois, that 0.2%, would have probably been maybe a 5% in North Dakota with a smaller population if they had that many people go in. But since this is a different type of study where it's comparing it and it's looking at it, these communities have really, some of them even been just absolutely hammered by population growth and lack thereof, and people moving out or not moving in. And at least from a population standpoint,
it's stagnant.
It's stagnant. And think about it, like a lot of these places, sure, they aren't like these, hubs like New York, LA, Miami, Dallas, places like that. But you got like Chicago. You have, there are several metropolitan areas that aren't these tiny, tiny towns. So, for them to get hit like this, and to me they're still fairly geographically close to, parts of the Northeast that are, booming economically with a lot of
and
political
huge
stuff.
Increase in population and tax revenue and
exactly.
So this is from 2010 to 2015. And some of the states that we're looking at is like Michigan plus 0.4, Minnesota is like plus 3.5, Kansas plus 2.1, Ohio plus 0.7. So it's not a significant increase in their population over the course of those 5 years.
Right, exactly. And the upcoming census information that is going out is predicted to be no better. We don't know how much worse, but that's almost the same as being worse. Is I think a lot of people here see just this growth, and even if they're not necessarily losing more and more, if they stay at this percent, they're still, if they're below the national average, they're still in a way, being left behind. And this article really talks about how a lot of it has to do with, kids going to college. And a lot of people, even from California, New York, here, wherever, they go out of state. And from a lot of these towns, they don't come back after college. They, whether it is for economic purposes back home, or you go to college, you make some of the most meaningful friendships and relationships of your life. And most people actually end up settling down fairly close to their college town because of the friendships, because of the connections that help lead them to a job there, things like that. So,
and again, those things aren't exactly unexpected. In Withnow's book, he talks about parents that encourage their kids to go to college out of state, and to, it's a source of pride within a rural community to say, hey, how's your son doing? Oh, he's doing great. He's living in the big city and he's got a job and a wife, and it's a talking point, but it's also a huge source of pride. So it's not that they're leaving these rural communities out of disgust or anything like that. There's a certain expectation to them leaving these towns as well.
Yeah, exactly. This does have a broader political impact. So on this same article, a little further down, we have a graph showing the decline in the Midwest's electoral college votes between 1972 and 2020.
So if you could just explain why that's significant.
Yeah, so this basically is this is going to show how essentially important your state is in an election. For instance, Illinois that had 26, or Ohio that used to have 25 in 1972, you were not a flyover state. You were visited by every politician and their mother. And you were an important state. Every 4 years, every election, like, you really mattered politically. And since then, some of them haven't dropped too much. So you look at, like, Indiana gone from 13 to 11. That's not a huge change. North Dakota, Nebraska, because of, their populations have stayed at the same. And the reason this information is important, because a lot of data, statistics will say between 2010, 2015, these short time spans, this 1972 to 2020 means that I'd say the vast majority of people living there, they've seen this throughout their entire life. They've watched this throughout their entire life. Illinois go from 26 down to 19 today, 19 electoral college votes. Ohio.
That is significant.
Yeah. I mean, Ohio from 25 down to 17, and Michigan from 21 to 15.
And not one of those that you mentioned is not a battleground state in almost every election.
Exactly. And yet it keeps declining. And since it's declining, what do you think's happening to other, more coastal states?
Yeah, they're seeing that increase.
There is a set number of electoral votes. It's not like they're disappearing altogether. Like, these, they're seeing other states get an increase here. So that's why the reason I wanted to bring this up is because, there are probably a lot of people who would hear, like, yeah, okay, they haven't had a huge increase in population, but they look at pros and cons and compare them and say, look at Colorado where cost of living is skyrocketing, and same with San Francisco and blah, 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 like, it's becoming quite congested. So how is that really one of the pain points? And to me, that is just an indicator to look at for a lot of these ripple effects. Like we see right here, like you mentioned, you mattered, this state, it was a big deal. Like you said, if you lived in Illinois, every, reporter on TV, every election had their eyes fixed on Illinois. And now it feels more like, oh, and by the way, Illinois.
Right, yeah. What I find, like, really fascinating is this is in the news a lot these days, because you've got, like you said, you have Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio, three huge battleground states that in 1972 all were over 20 electoral votes, and now all three of those are under 20 electoral votes and declining. So it makes sense that people that are worried about this may wish to change some of the questions on the census.
Yeah.
In order to regain that advantage they once had.
Right. And I think to clarify, like, when we bring this up, we're now I'm in no means trying to suggest, like, people in the Midwest are thinking, damn, remember how many electoral votes we used to have? But
I'm sure it's a coffee table conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, but it is something that is deeply symptomatic of seeing this left behind, seeing it continue. And like we just mentioned with the population statistics, if those continue to be below the national average, so if the coastal states keep seeing this increase in this significant increase in population, and they keep falling behind, 10 years from now, or 8 years, in a couple elections from now, where do you think Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, especially with automation and more jobs at risk and everything, I mean, agriculture a lot being automated now, and how do you think this is going to go? Which trend is it going in? So this is an example of how it really is this deep-seated feeling that isn't completely invalid of we're being left behind. We're continuously, like, we matter less and less.
So these population movements were kind of sold on the idea that there is an elitism, there is a economic advantage to these coastal areas, and the selling point is kind of, that's where the elites live, that's where the well-educated live. Does the data support that idea, or is that just sort of a media fabrication?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because an organization called AmericanProgress.org, they actually have this interactive chart on their site that has some detailed references with a lot of the data backed by some pretty robust research. And this is a map of the United States with each state categorized based on wage growth by state. And so then, for instance, over the last 16 years, or from 2000 to 2016 rather, the national average in terms of the wage growth and the real median wage growth, which means a real median wage growth is adjusted for inflation.
Cost of living, then, yeah.
Or
inflation. Yeah.
Inflation, yeah. So it isn't going to adjust for cost of living, but which makes it even more heartbreaking to see these in red, some of them. But you'd think that with that huge population change, like California getting so many people moving there, Colorado, how many people have moved here, especially since I think it was 2012, and when marijuana was legalized and we had a huge influx. And so you'd think that the states with this influx, there's this perception that they're kicking ass and taking names, but this shows the national average is somewhere around 8.5% growth during that 16-year period. But, and let's make no mistake, let's mention, the Midwest, they are below that average. Like, it's not like they're doing fine and don't know it. They definitely are, Indiana, 0.1% growth. Wow. The average is 8.5. And, Ohio, 1.1. Missouri, 2.6. Minnesota, 0.4. Michigan, minus 2.8. So they've seen a net negative. They've seen wages go down. But you actually have also states like Colorado, national average about 8.5%, 3.2%. And we both live here, we've seen cost of living go up a lot more than 3.2%. And California also 3.2% increase, even though they too have had such an influx in immigration and in people moving there, people who do have, formal education, computer science, master's degrees and things like that, yet the wages have not really been commensurate. And you look at some of these red states, average 8.5%, North Carolina, 11.3%, West Virginia, 11.6%, Virginia, 9.4%, so Alabama, 11.1%. So that isn't suggesting that there are states in the middle that, aren't hurting and they're imagining it and media's lying to them. This just shows that, to me, when I saw this, I felt like this stood out as maybe this economic divide there is more gray area. It's not like the coasts are all kicking ass and taking names and the middle is just totally getting hammered. Parts of the middle are getting hammered, but there's some big ones on the coast that are too.
Yeah, and what I found fascinating was when you flip the switch on this. Okay, so one of the things that this graph breaks down is it has employment rate change from 2000 to 2016, and then one of the other categories is wage growth from 2000 to 2016. What you notice is that the states that have the highest wage growth, like Montana, at 24%, when you look at the employment rate, it's actually at negative 2.4%. Their average wage is increasing, and the people there to do those jobs is driving it up. So if you look at, or I should say the lack of people there is driving the wage up. The demand for the labor is there. And so the increase in the wage has gone up. So you look at California, and their employment rate change is at 3.3%. But then when you look at their wage growth, it's at 3.2%, which is not keeping up. And where you see that data correlated the most is in the South. So along the southern states that, kind of border the Gulf, from North Carolina over to like Arkansas, all of those states show a positive wage growth, starting with North Carolina at 11.3 and Arkansas up 17.3% in wage growth. However, when you click the data over, you see that all of those states are negatively employed. So that means the wages are going up, the demand for labor is going up, and the people there to do the jobs, well, they're not there to do the jobs. The jobs are available, and they're paying more to attract people. So that is a situation that may lead some to think that perhaps immigration can solve that wage gap. So in the research that I've been doing on small towns, one of the recurring themes is the that Protestant work ethic. Hard work, labor. The get up in the morning and personal accountability and personal responsibility and get out there and work. Is that sentiment correlated to any data that shows that hard work is not only accurate, but it is contributing?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting you brought that up because we do have some data actually from Wikipedia on GDP. So, for instance, and anyone who is not too familiar, your GDP, like the nation's GDP, is the economic output, the overall contribution the country makes economically. And when you actually sort it by state, take the top 10 Midwest states, and you're looking at 20% of the country. And
wow.
You're looking at over 20% GDP of the total national GDP. You're getting close to 25% GDP increase, but with only 20% of the 20% of the states, and not just 20% of the states. This is something where, and we can dive into the population, because I guarantee you, when you look at Kansas, Missouri, Wisconsin, Indiana, these are not 20% if you add these up, that's not 20% of the population yet.
But they're pulling 20% of the GDP.
20% of the GDP. So the reason this is important is if you're generating a GDP that is greater than your own gains. So this is the economic result of my output, what I've done, with my hard work and things like that. So this means that essentially, in a nutshell, what they are delivering to the economy and GDP is greater than what they are getting out of it.
Interesting.
And that's why you look at a lot of states that don't have that sentiment. They are getting a lot out of out of what they're putting in. Some of them even getting more out of it than what they are contributing or putting in. And so these states are indicating, especially when you compare it and you look at the population changes, you look at the wage changes, you would think the fact that they still are getting up every day, putting their boots on and working that 12-hour brutally rough labor in a farm or something like that would be rewarded or recognized at least more than it has been. But when you look at those other factors, and even going back to that electoral college, it's like you're getting hit from all angles.
You're contributing more and your voice is equal to less. Outside influence looking down upon them within their community. And anybody can understand that. No one likes to be looked down on. No one likes to be called a flyover state. Right. And especially if you're pulling more of your percentage of the weight to the rest of the economy, then it's a little frustrating that it's somewhat paradoxical, because at the same time that they're pulling this weight, they don't want outside influence or large government programs. They want stuff that is regionally or locally based, more organic, to fix the problems within their society. There is a struggle to kind of re-identify what is the root cause of the problems in these towns. And a lot of them see it as the cultural decline, the moral decline. Another book I read was by a guy named J.D. Vance. It's called Hillbilly Elegy. He grew up, he is a self-described hillbilly who grew up in Jackson, Kentucky. It's a town of just a couple thousand people. And it is a fantastic book. No matter what side of the political aisle you stand on, he outlines growing up in a neighborhood where his mother was addicted to pain medication, and what he calls his mama and papa, his grandparents, did their best to help raise him. And he sees that same sort of trend being the cultural decline that is affecting them. So I just want to play you this clip from the book.
Yeah.
And just kind of set the stage. He kind of goes through a couple of the highlights. This is in the conclusionary portion of the audiobook. And he talks about, a young man that he's sort of taken under his wing to mentor, and that person's name is Brian. And he just kind of lays out what he feels the solution is. So let's have a listen.
Yeah.
I believe we hillbillies are the toughest goddamn people on this earth. We take an electric saw to the hide of those who insult our mother. We make young men consume cotton undergarments to protect a sister's honor. But are we tough enough to do what needs to be done to help a kid like Brian? Are we tough enough to build a church that forces kids like me to engage with the world rather than withdraw from it? Are we tough enough to look ourselves in the mirror and admit that our conduct harms our children? Public policy can help, but there is no government that can fix these problems for us. Recall how my cousin Mike sold his mother's house, a property that had been in our family for over a century, because he couldn't trust his own neighbors not to ransack it. Mamaw refused to purchase bicycles for her grandchildren because they kept disappearing, even when locked up, from her front porch. She feared answering her door toward the end of her life because an able-bodied woman who lived next door would not stop bothering her for cash. Money, we later learned, for drugs. These problems were not created by governments or corporations or anyone else. We created them, and only we can fix them. We don't need to live like the elites of California, New York, or Washington, D.C. We don't need to work 100 hours a week at law firms and investment banks. We don't need to socialize at cocktail parties. We do need to create a space for the JDs and Bryans of the world to have a chance. I don't know what the answer is precisely, but I know that it starts when we stop blaming Obama or Bush or faceless companies and ask ourselves what we can do to make things better.
what I hear in that clip is rugged individualism, that sense of personal accountability and responsibility. And I'm going to pull back on that in a little bit, but I just want to get your immediate reaction from that.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard that, it did hit, home in a way where, I know a lot of people and friends, relatives, and used to work at a company where it was basically owned, operated. Everyone working there was, Midwestern, and they had that ideal of individual responsibility, but in a way where they did believe you should be responsible for your success and your failure. And a boss once told me, he wants to teach his son that if you fail, if you screw up, if you make a terrible decision, no, the government shouldn't come bail you out. Like, if you're in jail, you're probably in jail for a reason.
Yeah.
And so anyway, but with the issues, the opioid epidemic, and with the, factories closing down and everything, there's so many issues, so many things happening, just like a domino effect over and over again, that are things that can't be solved by individualism.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really almost feels like your own core value system is not as strong, is kind of, like you believe in it, but you're showing up to the game and suddenly you're just losing every fight, every game. 20 years ago, you were building your house by hand, by yourself. The pride in that, everyone in the neighborhood was proud of you for that, while your neighbor's sitting on the lawn after hiring 20 people to build his house. Nobody's really, respecting that guy. And then 20 years later, his house is still standing and partying, and yours is starting to creak a bit and fall apart a little. And when people drive by, which house now do they want to buy?
Yeah.
Which house are they gonna want to go to for the party? So it feels like, this was the core value I had. The quality was having that individualism, and it's starting to kind of fray.
Yeah.
And it needs to. There are problems that are going to need a much larger solution, from a larger group.
So,
and yeah.
But I think, you're right in that all of these areas, these individual areas, that they all have worked to, sustain hard work and sense of community, and the church, and the family unit. All of those things are slowly breaking down, and even though they're working equally as hard, it's not elevating them out of that situation. And his own experience, J.D. Vance's own experience, was, they worked like hell to get him out of there. And there were government programs in the GI Bill that he took advantage of as well, and that helped put him on the right path. And, the hard work combined with those things and the sense of family is all what he takes pride in. But I disagree with his sentiment that, it's all comes down to hard work and family. There are larger systemic issues. And what I want to cover now is a different perspective on that. This is from the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. It's written by Thomas Frank, who is from Kansas. And he points to, he looks at Midwestern states as being people that are drawn to that cultural fix rather than a political or policy fix.
All right.
So I just want to read from him what the difference is between his point of view and someone like J.D. Vance. So let me just pull this up real fast. So this was written in 2004, before the Tea Party movement or before the Republican Party really started to veer to the right. And he's talking about the split within the party between moderates and more conservative members, more like cultural conservatives. And he's kind of doing it in a, sort of a sarcastic way. So just with that in mind, He says, there are moderate Republicans who drink Chardonnay and who put Martha's Vineyard stickers on their sobs. There are mods who insist on European-style coffee and whole-grain breads and high-end chocolates. There are mods who shop at Restoration Hardware and Whole Foods and look down on those who shop at Walmart. There are mods who listen to NPR and who insist on speaking French to the waitress when at a French restaurant. There are mods who go to gay-friendly, super waspy Episcopal churches and who disapprove of the Patriot Act and who rally in support of immigrant rights. There are mods who assume that all working-class whites are racist. But such people aren't liberal. What they are is corporate. And he goes on to say, conservatives may not understand why, but business culture has melded with counterculture for reasons having a great deal to do with business culture's usual priority, profit. This situation may be paradoxical, but it is also universal. For decades, Americans have experienced a populist uprising that only benefits the people it's supposed to be targeting. In Kansas, we merely see this extreme version of this mysterious situation. The angry workers, mighty in numbers, are marching irresistibly against the arrogant. They are shaking their fists at the sons of privilege. They are laughing at the dainty affections of the Leewood toffs. They are massing at the gates of Mission Hills, hoisting the black flag, while the millionaires tremble in their mansions. They are bellowing out their terrifying demands. We are here, they scream, to cut your taxes. The thing that Frank says, that Thomas Frank says, that I found fascinating, though, was the idea that the counterculture is being co-opted by people who will benefit from the outrage that is being stirred. So it's interesting to me that today when you talk to conservative Republicans, they are very anti-government. They're very, they don't trust the establishment. They don't trust establishment media. They don't trust establishment science. They don't trust, in some cases, establishment medical practices. And when you look back at the hippie movement, they were the ones that didn't trust the establishment.
Right.
And now it's just flipped, and back then, Democrats and more liberal people were getting into office and benefiting and, grabbing the levers of power, and that helped them. And that counterculture movement just sort of sat there at the bottom, getting more and more angry, but, nothing was ever addressed by it. And then you see the same in the political right. They're getting more and more angry, but tax cuts are not helping the Midwest.
Right, and I think a lot of the rhetoric is because if you take them out,
just to clarify,
yeah,
tax cuts on the wealthiest Americans are
right.
not helping the poorest Americans.
Right.
That's a better way of saying that.
The socialism for the 1%, as I say, we're not a capitalist or socialist country. We're socialist for the very top and capitalist for the rest of us. Pop culture, for lack of a better term, and overall with American culture, they are being left behind and kicked in the teeth. Like it's not the same knife like the economy is, but it is still a twist that hurts. Is this correct? Am I right in this?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I was thinking about it the other day. Let's say you were born in, 1915. And you grew up, and as a young man, you fought in the Second World War, and then you came back to your town of Akron, Ohio, or Youngstown, or something, and you get a job at GM, and you retire in 1979 on a pension, and then you die in 1989, right? Your existence would look a lot more like Andy Griffith's show than it would like Trailer Park Boys. You know what I mean?
Right.
You would have these small towns that function very well, don't have a lot of outside problems. And then today, the small town, there's a cultural difference. You have a side of town that is predominantly Mexican. You have another side of town that is poor and living on government assistance, and you have drug problems, and you have things coming in from the city that years ago, were not problems. You have people using AR-15s at church. It is not the same culture as it was when Sheriff Andy Taylor was in town.
Right. And, it's funny you mention that because, look, personally, and, I might get some unsavory comments in the comment section for saying this, but me, like there's not like nothing anti-immigrant about me. I think it is a good thing, especially you look at economically, like the top performing states are also in terms of GDP and opportunity and wages and everything are also the most diverse with the highest percentage of immigrants. So there's data showing that it's a great thing. But I remember, I forget where it was. I was on a business trip and went to a couple grocery stores here and there, picking stuff up while I'm there. And then I went to one on my last day, and I think it was like a Cheerios box, like one that I had seen a million times. And, the slogan or something on there was in Spanish, and it didn't bother me, but you noticed it.
Right.
A slogan that you would have never in a million years paid any attention to because you're so used to seeing it. And, I think for some people, especially if you have lived in a community where every single thing has been hammered and changed not for the better, just any change.
Yeah.
Any change, it's like, I tell people, like, I have a hard time believing it's just an immigrant, the idea of some Mexican coming into town. It's the fact that, like, every game they've lost, like, every battle they keep losing, and it's more like they are literally about to break. And because these Midwestern folks, like, go meet them. They are some of the toughest people you'll ever meet.
Yeah.
They are a bridge that can withstand, 500 million, tons of weight, but they're at, 500 million now. And just
adding,
that one Mexican who starts walking across the bridge, like, yes, they're harmless. They're not gonna, it just feels like there's been so much that they just don't want any more change.
Yeah.
Because every change has been negative change. Do you think that's kind of part of it?
Covers that in the Left Behind. He's talking about how the older generation, it kind of safeguards the status quo, and I was here when such and such a factory, opened and when it closed, and this is the way we've always done it, and why should we have to change? And this is how the town has always operated, and we know what we're doing. We don't need this outside influence. But it has been, immigration is one issue, but immigration is what has fueled rural communities since this country was founded. Germans settled the Great Lakes area, and the Scottish and the English and the Irish settled the Midwest, and it's been a part. And you can go back and look at sentiments towards the Irish in the early 1900s. It wasn't good, and the language was no different than it is towards Mexicans. So there's a racial component to it, but there's also I think it's counterintuitive to push back on immigration for these towns, and you can argue it either way, but it's a cultural shift, and those that are safeguarding the town see it as a threat to the existing culture, and that's why they're so against it. It may not be because of racism. It is more a issue of the ideals that they have instilled in this town. They are being asked to compromise on, and they just don't understand why, because it has always worked previous to that compromise. You've been listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you might have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. And you can also check out our other episodes at itmightbeinteresting.com.
Yeah, I remember in the 80s, almost every television show, like sitcom, was pretty much the same.
Right.
It was a middle upper class family with a few characters for kids, so like Family Ties, with Alex Keaton, and then you had the Cosby Show, which was an affluent black family, and there wasn't really anything covering the middle. And then two shows came on the air. One was about a shoe salesman who had a stay-at-home wife and two rambunctious kids.
Oh my God, that was such a good show.
So Married with Children hits the air. And then the other one was Roseanne.
Yep.
A lower middle-class family, or even a poor family. The father was a drywaller, and the mother worked at a plastics factory that made forks. And, their couch had a quilt over it. Their kids were disrespectful. They were problem kids in school, and they're just always getting into trouble. And the problems that they had in the first episode were still there in the season finale.
Right.
And it really just sort of transcended. And it was interesting when her show came back on that it was not perceived in the same, political light as when it went off the air originally in the 90s.